The Duke of Kestrel Chase looked at the thin woman shivering in his cavernous hall, her gray wool dress no match for the stone's pervasive chill. He looked at her aunt, Lady Lavinia Yardley, whose expression was a brittle mask of desperation and greed. Then his gaze returned to the niece, Hester Penrose. "She won't survive the winter here," the Duke said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. It was not a statement of concern, it was a statement of fact, a term of a cruel bargain being struck. Lady Lavinia's smile tightened. "Miss Penrose is more resilient than she appears, Your Grace." The Duke, Gideon Devereux, did not smile back. He simply watched Hester, who stood with her spine straight, her hands clasped, her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. She did not plead or flinch. She simply endured, as she had learned to endure everything. 1 week earlier, Hester had been enduring in a different house, one whose decay was hidden behind cheap polish and desperate gentility. She sat at a small, scarred desk in the corner of the morning room, her father's ledgers spread before her. Not his. Not anymore. They were Lady Lavinia's now, and they told a story of ruin in neat columns of copperplate script. A shilling for ribbons for her cousin Dinah, £10 for a new fan, 20 for a disastrous night at the card table. Hester's own careful accounting of the household expenses, the butcher, the baker, the coal merchant, was a grim counterpoint. She moved a shilling from the dwindling household fund to cover the cost of beeswax, knowing the floors must shine for the dinner party her aunt was planning. It was a performance, this household, and Hester was its invisible stage manager. Her only reward was a cold bed, a plain plate, and the continued shelter of a roof she paid for with her mind and her hands. In her pocket, her fingers found the familiar shape of a small wooden bird, a kestrel her father had carved for her years ago. One of its wings had a tiny, splintered break at the tip. It felt like a mirror of her own state, whole but damaged. The dinner was Lady Lavinia's grandest gamble. Its target was Gideon Devereux, a man spoken of in whispers, a widower, impossibly wealthy, who had buried himself at his estate, Kestrel Chase, since his wife's death 3 years prior. He was said to be cold as the sea in winter, a man of iron and silence. But he was a duke, and Dinah needed a duke. Dinah, lovely and laughing and utterly unaware of the financial precipice on which she danced, was radiant. Hester, in her mended gray, was instructed to be present but silent, a shadow at the edge of the candlelight. The conversation was a stream of vetted gossip and careful flattery, which the Duke absorbed with unnerving stillness. Then Mr. Carmichael, father of the beautiful Felicity, who also had her eyes on the Duke, brought up a tedious local dispute about a parcel of land bordering the Kestrel Chase estate. "The old maps are notoriously unreliable," he blustered, appealing to the Duke. "The stream has shifted its course over the century." "The survey of 1782 is quite clear," a voice said, quiet but precise. The table fell silent. It was Hester. Lady Lavinia's face went rigid with fury. Hester felt a flush creep up her neck, but her voice remained steady. "The boundary is not the stream itself, but a line of 3 ancient oaks on the western bank. It is detailed in the 3rd folio of the Estate Atlas, page 17. She had seen the atlas in her own father's library, before he had died, and his collection was sold to pay the first of the debts her aunt had accrued. The Duke's dark eyes, which had been hooded with boredom, lifted and fixed on her. He did not look at her as a man looks at a woman. He looked at her as a scholar looks at a text, searching for authenticity. There was a flicker of something in their depths. Not interest, not kindness. It was recognition. He saw a mind where everyone else saw a mouse. "Page 17, he repeated, a quiet confirmation. He said nothing more on the matter, but for the rest of the dinner, Hester felt the weight of his occasional, assessing gaze. She had broken her aunt's rule. She had spoken. And in doing so, She had sealed her fate. The days after the dinner were a quiet storm. A letter arrived from a creditor, its tone no longer patient. Lady Lavinia grew paler, her temper shorter. Dinah complained that her allowance was late. Hester said nothing, simply continuing her work, stretching the remaining funds with a painful ingenuity. She knew the end was near. It came not as a crash, but as a quiet, final summons. A carriage bearing the crest of a kestrel arrived at their door. Lady Lavinia, her face a mask of false composure, went to see the Duke. Hester remained behind, polishing silver that was not truly theirs, waiting. She did not know what her aunt intended to offer, but she knew it would have Dinah at its center. When Lady Lavinia returned, her expression was one of triumphant, venomous relief. "Pack your things, Hester," she commanded, her voice sharp. "You are to go to Kestrel Chase." Hester's hands stilled. "I?" Dinah, who had been preening before a mirror, turned in confusion. "But, Mamma, I thought—" Her mother cut her off. "The Duke has no need of a wife at present. He has need of a librarian, an archivist. He requires someone to put his estate papers in order." She gestured at Hester's work on the desk. "It seems your peculiar talents have finally proven useful." The offer was as cold and hard as the Duke himself. He would pay Hester a salary for 1 year, a salary generous enough to settle Lady Lavinia's most pressing debts and secure a small income for her and Dinah. In exchange, he would have Hester's mind, her memory, her labor. It was not a rescue. It was a transaction. Hester was being sold. And so she found herself standing in the great hall of Kestrel Chase, a house that seemed to be carved from ice and shadow. It was vast, silent, and grieving. The air was thick with the scent of cold stone and disuse. The Duke stood before her, his face impassive. It was then he had made his pronouncement to her aunt. "She won't survive the winter here." Lady Lavinia had offered a brittle assurance, and then departed with an air of a jailer handing over a prisoner, leaving Hester alone with the Duke and a formidable-looking housekeeper in a black dress, whose gaze was even colder than the flagstones under Hester's worn shoes. The housekeeper, Mrs. Draycott, looked Hester up and down, her lips a thin, disapproving line. The Duke spoke, his words clipped. "Mrs. Draycott will show you to your room. Your work will begin tomorrow. The library is in the West Wing. I expect a preliminary report on the state of the archives in 1 week." He did not wait for a reply, simply turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing into the oppressive silence. Hester watched him go. She felt a tremor of fear, but she pushed it down. She had survived her aunt's house. She would survive this one. She lifted her chin, meeting the housekeeper's hostile stare. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She would work. She would earn her keep. And she would endure. The great doors of Kestrel Chase closed behind her with a sound of finality, shutting out the world she knew and locking her inside a gilded cage of stone and secrets. Her room was in the servants' wing, clean but spare, with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking a bleak, gray courtyard. The cold was a physical presence, seeping from the walls, clinging to the thin blanket on the bed. The first few days were a blur of methodical labor in a library that was more a tomb than a place of learning. Dust lay thick as snow on everything, and the air was frigid, smelling of decaying paper and mice. Mrs. Draycott watched her with hawk-like suspicion, as if expecting her to steal the tarnished silver inkwells or set fire to the priceless manuscripts. Meals were solitary affairs in a small, cheerless dining room, the food plain, the silence absolute. Hester spoke to no one, and no one spoke to her. She was a ghost in a house of ghosts. But the archive was a puzzle, and Hester's mind, starved for meaningful work, came alive. She was not merely tidying, she was excavating. She found ledgers bound in rotting leather, bundles of correspondence tied with faded ribbon, architectural drawings, and tenant rolls stretching back 2 centuries. It was the heart of the estate, and it was dying of neglect. She began not by sorting, but by reading. She created a system, her neat script filling the pages of a new notebook. She cross-referenced names, dates, and transactions. She worked from dawn until the light failed, her fingers numb with cold, her only companions the rustle of paper and the scuttling of unseen things in the walls. The Duke was an absence. She saw him only occasionally, a tall, dark figure crossing a distant lawn or disappearing down a long corridor. He never approached the library. He never acknowledged her presence. It was as if their transaction in the hall had been the beginning and end of their association. Then, slowly, things began to change. Not through words, but through small, almost imperceptible actions. One morning, she entered the library to find a small stack of freshly cut kindling and a box of matches beside the cavernous fireplace. It was an invitation. She hesitated for only a moment before laying the fire. The first crackle of flame was a sound of defiance in the frozen silence. The warmth, tentative at first, began to push back the oppressive chill. A few days later, a tray appeared on a side table, bearing a pot of tea and a single cup. It was placed there silently while she was retrieving a book from a high shelf. It was Mrs. Draycott's doing, she knew. It was not a gesture of friendship, but of grudging acknowledgement. The strange, silent woman in the library was not idle. She was working. Hester began to uncover more than just dust. She found discrepancies. Small at first, a bill for roof repairs on a barn that had been demolished a decade earlier, payments for seed that was never delivered. Then, larger things. Rent payments from tenants that were recorded as lower in the main ledger than on the original receipts she found bundled in a dusty crate. A pattern began to emerge, a quiet, systematic bleeding of the estate's wealth, all dating from the tenure of the previous steward, a man who had retired a year ago. The architect of this quiet fraud was a solicitor from Merivale, a Mr. Randolph Ingram, whose name appeared again and again, countersigning questionable expenses. The same Mr. Ingram who was her aunt's solicitor. A cold knot formed in Hester's stomach. This was more than neglect. This was a conspiracy. She said nothing to the Duke. She had been hired to catalogue, not to investigate. Instead, she doubled her efforts, her work taking on a new urgency. She was not just restoring an archive, she was uncovering a crime. And as she worked, the house seemed to respond. She took it upon herself to polish the wood of the library shelves with beeswax and lavender, and the scent began to replace the smell of decay. She found a magnificent tapestry hanging in a dark corner, its subject a kestrel in flight, its threads dull with grime and partly unraveled. In the evenings, by the light of her fire, she began the painstaking work of cleaning and mending it, her needle moving with the same precision as her pen. One evening, the Duke appeared in the doorway of the library. He did not enter, simply stood in the shadows, watching her. The firelight flickered across her bent head, the glint of the needle in her hand. She was so absorbed in her task, she did not notice him for several minutes. When she finally looked up, her eyes met his across the room. He held her gaze for a long moment, an unreadable expression on his face. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then he was gone. The silence he left behind was different. It was no longer empty. It was charged with a new awareness. Kestrel Chase was beginning to wake up, and so was its master. The thaw, once begun, continued in small, incremental ways. The Duke started taking his evening meal not in his private study, but in the small dining room where Hester ate. They sat at opposite ends of a long table, the silence still a vast territory between them. But it was a shared silence now. He would ask a perfunctory question about her progress. "Have you located the land grants from the third Earl?" She would answer with precision. "Yes, Your Grace. They are in the blue chest, but the seals on 2 are broken." He would nod, and that would be the extent of their conversation. Yet it was a beginning. Mrs. Draycott's gruffness softened. A second blanket appeared on Hester's bed. A small vase with a single winter rose was placed on her dinner tray. The servants, who had first viewed her with suspicion, now offered quiet greetings in the hallways. They saw the library warming, the ledgers being tamed, the order spreading from that one room like a gentle tide. Hester was no longer just the poor relation from Coombe Norton. She was the quiet force bringing their cold, grieving house back to life. Her work with the tenants began by accident. An elderly farmer, Mr. Abbott, came to the house, his hat in his gnarled hands, to dispute a notice of rent arrears. Mrs. Draycott was about to send him away to deal with the new steward, a brusque and impatient man. Hester, passing through the hall, overheard. She recognized the name. "Mr. Abbott," she said, her voice stopping him. "Your farm is the one with the old stone wall. You paid your rent on the 1st of October. I have the receipt. It was misrecorded in the main ledger." She retrieved the document from the library, its details clear in her memory. The farmer looked at her with astonished gratitude. The steward looked at her with irritation, but the matter was settled. Word spread through the tenant farms. Miss Penrose, the Duke's archivist, was the one who knew the truth. She was fair. She listened. They began to come to her, bypassing the steward, bringing their disputes and their questions. She would listen patiently, then retreat to the library and emerge with the answer, written on a piece of paper in her clear, decisive hand. She was becoming more than an archivist. She was becoming the memory and the conscience of Kestrel Chase. It was this growing influence that brought the first real sign of opposition. Felicity Carmichael began to call at the estate, her visits becoming more frequent. She was everything Hester was not. Beautiful, exquisitely dressed, radiating an effortless social confidence. She treated Kestrel Chase as if it were already her domain, and Hester as a piece of furniture within it. "Still playing with your dusty papers, Miss Penrose?" she would ask, with a bright, dismissive smile, her eyes sweeping over Hester's plain dress. "You must be so diligent." The word diligent was made to sound like an insult, a synonym for drudge. Felicity would seek out the Duke, her laughter echoing in the long corridors that had been silent for so long. She would try to draw him out, to remind him of his social duties, of the world beyond his grieving walls. To Hester's observant eye, the Duke seemed to endure these visits more than enjoy them. He remained polite, distant, his face a mask of aristocratic courtesy. But Felicity was persistent, and society was on her side. She was the logical choice for the Duchess. Hester was an anomaly, a gray wren in a house of eagles. The true threat, however, was gathering from afar. A letter arrived from Dinah, a rare occurrence. It was filled with her usual chatter about dresses and parties, but a single sentence snagged Hester's attention. "Mama is in a dreadful state, always closeted with that dreary Mr. Ingram. I believe they are plotting to win the lottery, for all the good it will do us." Mr. Ingram. The name sent a chill down Hester's spine. Her aunt and the solicitor whose fraud she was slowly, meticulously documenting. They knew she was here. They must have guessed what she was doing. Her quiet work in the library was no longer just about restoring order. It had become dangerous. The forces that had profited from the estate's neglect would not surrender quietly. They would move from the social snubs of Felicity Carmichael to something far more concrete and far more vicious. Hester felt a new kind of cold, one that had nothing to do with the winter air. It was the cold of fear. She looked at the half-mended tapestry of the Kestrel, its flight still broken. The battle for Kestrel Chase had just begun. The attack came, as she had feared, through a piece of paper. It was subtle, elegant, and designed to ruin her completely. Felicity Carmichael brought it, her face a perfect portrait of reluctant concern. She found the Duke in his study, a place Hester had never entered. "Gideon," she said, her voice hushed with false gravity. "I came upon this by the purest accident. A groom found it near the east gate. I would not trouble you with it, but its contents, they seem so treacherous." She handed him a folded sheet of paper. It was a letter, written in a passable imitation of Hester's hand. It was addressed to a rival landowner, Lord Osmond, a man with whom the Devereux family had a long-standing boundary dispute. The letter offered to provide proofs and maps from the archive that would support Lord Osmond's claim, in exchange for a handsome sum of money. It was a work of artful villainy, containing just enough detail about the archive to seem authentic. It painted Hester not as a quiet scholar, but as a cunning thief and a traitor to the house that had given her shelter. Gideon Devereux read the letter twice. His face, already so often a mask of control, became utterly unreadable. He did not thank Felicity or dismiss her. He simply folded the paper and placed it in his coat pocket. "I will handle this," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. The words hung in the air, a quiet dismissal. Felicity, perhaps expecting a more dramatic reaction, an outburst, a grateful confidence, was left looking momentarily wrong-footed before she recovered her poise and took her leave. For the rest of the day, a terrible silence descended upon Kestrel Chase, heavier and colder than any that had come before. Mrs. Draycott seemed to hold her breath. The very walls seemed to be waiting. Hester, working in the library, felt the shift in the atmosphere. She knew something was wrong. She continued her work, her hands steady, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She would not hide. She would wait for the blow to fall. It fell that evening. He did not summon her to his study. He came to the library, the letter in his hand. He stood before the fire, the flames casting his tall frame into imposing shadow. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He held out the letter. "Explain this." It was not a request. It was a command. Hester took the paper. Her hands did not tremble. She read the careful forgery, the damning words. She thought of her aunt's desperation. She thought of Mr. Ingram's cunning. She thought of Felicity's triumphant malice. Any other woman might have burst into tears, into frantic denials. Hester did not. She had only one weapon, and she had been honing it her entire life. The truth, plain and unadorned. She looked up from the page, her gaze direct and unwavering, meeting his. "This is a forgery," she said, her voice as calm as if she were discussing a misplaced book. He raised a skeptical eyebrow. "It is a remarkable imitation of your hand." "It is clever," she conceded, "but it is not perfect." She laid the letter on the table beside a sheet of her own notes, the two scripts side by side in the lamplight. "Look, the forger makes the letter T with a straight cross. I make mine with a slight curve, always. And the letter G, the loop is too round. Mine is more angular." She pointed to the details, her finger tracing the subtle differences. "But the true errors are not in the script. They are in the substance." Her voice gained a new strength, the authority of absolute knowledge. "The paper. This is modern linen paper, made in the mill at Ottersley. The letter purports to be from 2 months ago, but the watermark," she held it up to the light, "is one they began using only last month. Furthermore, the letter mentions the red-bound atlas. The atlas containing the boundary maps is bound in green leather. It has always been green leather. Anyone who had actually worked in this archive would know that." She lowered the paper, her explanation complete. She had presented her evidence. She did not plead or beg him to believe her. She simply stood, waiting for his verdict. From the perspective of Gideon Devereux, Gideon watched her. He had been watching her for weeks. He had seen the way she moved, with a quiet purpose that was the antithesis of the frantic energy that defined most of society. He had seen her mind at work, bringing a century of chaos into pristine order. He had seen her kindness to old Abbott, a kindness rooted not in sentiment, but in fact. He had seen the way the light from the fire caught the auburn threads in her plain brown hair as she bent over the Kestrel tapestry, mending something beautiful that his own grief had allowed to fall into ruin. He had brought her here as a tool, a solution to a problem, a mind to be employed. He had told her aunt she would not survive the winter, and, in his cold, pragmatic way, he had meant it. The house was a reflection of his own soul, frozen, silent, unwelcoming. He had not expected her to bring the thaw. When Felicity had brought him the letter, his first reaction had been a flare of ice-cold rage, the rage of betrayal. He had allowed this quiet, unassuming woman into the heart of his estate, into its very memory, and she had used it against him. It confirmed every cynical belief he held about the world since his wife's death, that loyalty was a commodity and trust was a fool's game. He had wanted to believe the letter. Believing it was easier. It meant he could retreat back into the safety of his numbness, his isolation confirmed. He could dismiss her, send her away, and the house would fall silent again, just as it had been before. Safe. Empty. But as he stood before her now, listening to her calm, devastatingly precise defense, something shifted. It was not her words alone. It was the way she delivered them. There was no hysteria, no fear. There was only the quiet, unshakable confidence of the truth. She was not asking for his faith. She was presenting him with evidence. The watermark is one they began using only last month. The atlas is bound in green leather. These were not the arguments of a liar. They were the facts of a scholar. He looked from her clear, steady eyes to the forged letter in his hand. He saw it for what it was. A crude weapon designed to pry her away from him, to send him back into the gilded cage Felicity and her kind had prepared for him. He had a choice. He could trust the ugly, convenient lie, or he could trust the difficult, extraordinary woman standing before him. He thought of the fire she had lit in this cold room. He thought of the order she had brought from chaos. He thought of the slow, patient mending of the broken tapestry. It was not pity he felt for her. It was admiration. A fierce, protective admiration he had not felt for anyone in years. He picked up the forged letter from the table. Without a word, he turned and tossed it into the fire. They both watched as the paper blackened, the treacherous words curling into ash. "I see," he said. The two words were an acquittal, a declaration of trust, and a promise. A promise that a reckoning was coming for those who had written it. The invitation was for a small dinner party at Kestrel Chase. The guest list was specific and, to the uninitiated, eclectic. There was Lady Lavinia Yardley and her daughter Dinah. There was Mr. Randolph Ingram, the solicitor from Merivale. There was Miss Felicity Carmichael. And, as the guest of honor, there was the Dowager Countess of Marley, Lady Octavia, a woman whose tongue was as sharp as her mind, and whose opinion could make or break a reputation in the county. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tensions. Lady Lavinia and Mr. Ingram wore expressions of smug conspiracy. Felicity was radiant, acting the part of the future duchess, certain that the librarian's dismissal was imminent. Dinah looked pale and nervous. Hester was present, seated at the far end of the table, as quiet and gray as ever. But tonight, there was a new stillness about her, a sense of coiled strength. Lady Octavia, a woman who missed nothing, observed the strange tableau with piercing curiosity. Dinner was a masterpiece of polite, brittle conversation. After the meal, the party retired to the grand drawing room, the very room where Hester had mended the Kestrel tapestry, which now hung, restored and magnificent, above the mantelpiece. The Duke did not offer brandy and cards. Instead, he remained standing by the fire. "I have asked you all here tonight," he began, his voice calm and measured, "to discuss a matter of estate business. Specifically, the long-disputed boundary with Lord Osmond's property." Mr. Ingram puffed out his chest, preparing to offer his legal opinion. Felicity shot a triumphant glance at Hester. This was it, the public humiliation. "There has recently been some confusion on the matter," the Duke continued, his eyes moving from face to face. "And a rather interesting document has come into my possession." He produced a piece of paper from his coat. Not the original forgery, but a perfect copy. A letter, seemingly from Miss Penrose, offering to sell estate secrets to Lord Osmond. A collective gasp went through the room. Lady Lavinia feigned shock. "Hester, how could you?" Felicity laid a hand on her heart. "Oh, the deceit!" Mr. Ingram shook his head sadly. "A terrible breach of trust, Your Grace." The Duke let the performance play out. Then he turned his cool gaze on Hester. "Miss Penrose, you have seen this document. Would you be so good as to share your professional assessment of it with our guests?" All eyes turned to Hester. She stood, her hands clasped before her. She was not a defendant in the dock. She was an expert on the stand. Calmly, clearly, she repeated her analysis. She spoke of the paper, the watermark, the ink. She detailed the errors in the script. She explained the crucial mistake about the color of the atlas. Her voice never wavered. It was a lecture, not a defense. When she finished, a stunned silence filled the room. Lady Octavia was leaning forward now, her eyes glittering with interest. "A clever argument," Mr. Ingram said with a dismissive sneer. "But it is your word against the evidence of this letter." "Not entirely," the Duke said softly. He gestured to a footman, who brought forward a stack of ledgers and placed them on a table. Hester's ledgers. Miss Penrose's work in the archive has been illuminating. She has uncovered a pattern of fraud stretching back 5 years. Overpayments, false invoices, unrecorded rents, all authorized by the previous steward, and all countersigned by you, Mr. Ingram. He opened the top ledger. For instance, the sum of £200 for repairs to the West Wing roof in a year when, as we all know, the West Wing was closed. Where did that money go, I wonder? Mr. Ingram's face turned the color of putty. Lady Lavinia began to look faint. The final, devastating blow, however, came from the weakest link in the conspiracy. Dinah, who had been twisting her gloves in her lap, her face a mask of misery, suddenly burst into tears. "I saw him!" she cried, pointing a trembling finger at the solicitor. "I saw Mr. Ingram in the study with Mamma. He was practicing her handwriting. He said it was for a legal document, a copy—" She broke down into sobs. The confession, unplanned and emotional, was more damning than any ledger. It was the truth, raw and undeniable. The conspiracy collapsed. Lady Lavinia wilted, her social ambition turning to ash. Mr. Ingram stood frozen, exposed and ruined. Felicity Carmichael, her face white with shock and fury at being associated with such a sordid, failed plot, looked at the Duke, then at Hester, her expression a mask of pure hatred. She had been a pawn in a game she thought she was winning. Lady Octavia let out a short, sharp sound, almost a laugh. "Well," she declared to the room at large, her gaze settling on Hester with profound respect, "it seems Kestrel Chase has found its memory again, and a formidable one it is." The public reckoning was complete. The villains were not shouted at or dragged away. They were simply seen. In the merciless light of the truth, their power evaporated, leaving only their greed and their foolishness on display for all to witness. Their quiet, dignified exit from the room was the beginning of their social exile. After they were gone, the great drawing room was profoundly quiet. Only Hester, the Duke, and the Dowager Countess remained. Lady Octavia rose, her posture regal. She walked to Hester and looked her squarely in the eye. "You, child," she said, her voice gruff but not unkind, "are made of sterner stuff than anyone in this county gives you credit for, myself included." She gave a curt nod to the Duke. "See that you appreciate what you have, Devereux." And with that, she swept from the room, leaving them alone. The silence that descended was different now. It was not empty or tense, but filled with the aftermath of a great storm. Hester stood by the fireplace, her hand resting on the mantel, near the restored tapestry. She felt drained, but also strangely calm. It was over. Gideon came to stand beside her. He did not look at her, but at the tapestry. "They underestimated you," he said, his voice low. "Everyone did." She simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. "The arrangement was for 1 year," he continued, turning to face her. "The debts I settled on your aunt's behalf are a trifle, now that I know the extent of Ingram's theft. You have repaid that debt 10 times over. You are free to leave Kestrel Chase. You are free to go wherever you wish." He said the words plainly, as if stating the terms of a contract. but she could hear the effort in his voice, the tension beneath the calm. He was offering her an escape from this cold house, from him. He was giving her a choice. She looked around the room, at the warm firelight on the polished wood, at the great kestrel soaring on the wall. This house was no longer a prison. She had poured her mind and her spirit into its cold stones, and it had become a part of her. Leaving felt less like freedom and more like exile. "And if I do not wish to be free of this place?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He finally met her gaze, and for the first time, the mask was gone. His eyes were full of a raw, unguarded emotion that made her breath catch. It was awe. It was reverence. It was a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. "Then I ask you to stay," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "Not as an archivist, not as an employee." He took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. And then, to her utter astonishment, the Duke of Kestrel Chase went down on one knee before her on the hearthrug. He took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I am asking you to stay as its duchess, as my wife." He looked up at her, his proud, guarded face full of a sincerity that stripped away all artifice. "Hester, plainly, I choose you." Her hand trembled in his. She thought of the shivering, invisible girl who had arrived here months ago. She thought of the quiet power she had found, not in beauty or charm, but in her own mind and her own integrity. He was not rescuing her. He was recognizing her. And she was choosing him in return. "Yes," she said. The word was small, but it filled the entire room. "Plainly, yes." We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The epilogue to their story was written not in dramatic scenes, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of the seasons. 1 year later, spring came to Kestrel Chase not as a hesitant visitor, but as a joyful resident. The house was alive. The great halls that had once echoed with silence now held the murmur of conversation, the scent of baking bread, and the occasional sound of the Duke's low, rumbling laughter, a sound Hester had single-handedly excavated from his grief. The gardens, long neglected, were now her domain. Under her guidance, neat rows of vegetables and vibrant flower beds replaced the overgrown weeds. The tenants no longer came to the house with their hats in their hands, heads bowed in supplication. They came to speak with their duchess, who knew their families by name, who understood the yield of their fields, and who consulted the old maps not to enforce boundaries, but to find just solutions. They answered to her not out of duty, but out of a deep, abiding respect. She had earned her title not by marriage, but by merit. She was standing on the south lawn, discussing the planting of a new orchard with the head gardener, when Gideon came to find her. He was no longer the forbidding figure in black, the lord of a frozen manor. He was her husband, his face softened by a quiet contentment that she had put there. He watched her for a moment, the woman in a simple blue dress who commanded more loyalty than any edict he had ever issued. The woman who had brought his world and his heart back from the dead. He came to her side, and the gardener, with a respectful nod, made himself scarce. "There is a frost predicted tonight," she said, looking at the newly planted saplings. "I've had Ned and the boys prepare covers for them." He smiled. "Of course you have." He reached into his coat pocket. "I have something for you." He placed a small object into her open palm. It was the little wooden kestrel her father had carved, the one she had carried as a talisman of her endurance. But it was different now. The tiny, splintered break on the tip of its wing was gone. In its place was a seamless, perfect repair. The grain of the new wood matched so flawlessly with the old that one had to look closely to see the join. The work was intricate, patient. It was the work of his own hands. She looked from the perfectly mended bird to his face, her eyes shining. "You fixed it," she whispered. "I had to," he said simply. "It was a reminder of something broken, and nothing in your life should be broken ever again." He laced his fingers through hers, their hands enclosing the small, precious bird together. They stood there for a long time, bathed in the gentle light of the late afternoon sun, looking out over the thriving lands of Kestrel Chase. The house was warm, the gardens were waking, and the kestrel, at last, was whole and ready to fly. Together. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.